Okay, we're going to get into your last video now of this chapter. I know it's been a long one, but with being 3 chapters long, it's going to tend to do that. Um, the last chapter you really want to get into in reading, and we're going to be working on this in class too, is chapter 1 now, over the very introduction of psychology. It kind of is a good chapter to use now as a review. It'll go over a lot of the psychologists that we've talked about, from Bandura to Watson to Freud to the others. So you want to make sure you are reading over that chapter now, and basically you just need to be dealing with pages right around 2 to like 12 on that chapter to get that done. And then we're going to be doing some in-class activities and some work to kind of get you ready for your tests, as we're getting very close to finishing up now. Okay, the last thing we're going to get into with this unit now is we're going to finish up with the last couple of schools of psychology. We finished up with behaviorism. We're going to move on into another part of behaviorism, so this is still kind of school 4 of the schools of psychology, but this is kind of a different offshoot of it. It was a different psychologist that created this theory. It's called social learning theory, and it's Albert Bandura. And basically this theory is a combination behaviorism and a little bit of psychodynamics there. The reason is because Bandura kind of took both ideas. He took the idea of the overt actions and the idea that you must have a lot of data driven by through observational learning to get this, but he also did not totally throw out the idea of the use of the mind and of the consciousness and how that plays into it. So he kind of put the two together when he created this theory then. The thrust of behaviorism is shaped through learning. People seek out and process information about the environment that maximizes their outcomes. Now, the key here difference between Bandura and dealing with the other behaviorist is that Bandura was saying that how you actually learn is through the use of the environment, but it's not so much your actions. It's not so much how you interact with the environment. It's how other people interact and then you observing them to learn from it. So think of it this way. You have an older brother or older sister that when you were growing up and you watch them get into all kinds of trouble with your parents and all kinds of problems maybe with school or law or anything like that, and you learned by not doing their behavior so that you wouldn't get in trouble later on. That's basically Bandura's social learning theory, is watching others, learning from that, and then you being able to shape your behavior based upon that. So if you see a friend of yours and they're going up to a teacher and asking them some questions, and next thing you know, the teacher's ripping on them because they didn't get their assignment done, and they give them a big long lecture, and you didn't get your assignment done, you're surely not going to go down there and do the same thing. You learned by watching your friend that that's not something that you want to get into of a behavior, so you will basically not do it. Okay, observable learning, as I mentioned, is an organism's responding influence by observing others. This process is called modeling. There's a 4-part process to it. First and foremost, before you can do anything with social learning theory, you have to do the attention part. You got to observe others. You got to watch what's going on around you. Then once you start to pick up on some of the observations that you like from other people, you store that mentally into your mind, and it's called retention. Then when the opportunity arises for you to try to use this new observable learning that you've been watching and that you like to acquire, you will do what's called reproduction. And then the final one is motivation. And that's basically, again, gets into that reinforcement process that you're going to continue to do that behavior if it gives you a positive motivation or a positive reinforcement, and you're not going to if it doesn't. So it's a pretty simple process that Bandura came up with, but it is has a lot of good impact to it when you begin to apply it. And we're going to again talk a little bit more about this and watch a video on it back in class. All right, the last school of psychology, then, we're not going to spend very much time on. Not that it's not important, but it's just not as relevant to the ones that we've been dealing with, is humanism. Basically, humanism came about in the 1960s, 70s, basically because a lot of the psychologists got tired of the fact that either you had behaviorism or you had psychodynamics as the main 2 theories at the time. Psychodynamics, or psychoanalytical theory, is they viewed it as very dehumanizing. Humanists believe that, if we're not these animals that are consumed by sex and aggression, as what Freud was saying and some of the other psychodynamic psychologists, and so they found that this was very unbecoming of us as a superior creature, that we are just driven by those two primary needs. They also didn't like the fact of behaviorism, because basically most behaviorists, when they were doing their observations of study and making all their theories, was based upon dealing with animal research. And so they didn't agree with that either. A humanist believes that people are independent thinkers. We're not pawns. We're not basically dealing with animal heritage or environment. A humanist believes that basically we have a theoretical orientation that emphasizes very unique qualities, especially dealing with the ideas of freedom and personal growth. The two biggest humanists that has contributed to the school of psychology. One is Carl Rogers, and he had what's called the person-centered theory. His ideas was this development of what's known as the self-concept, which is a collection of beliefs about one's unique qualities and their behaviors that they get. How this develops, according to humanists, is you have the scale here called the hierarchy of needs. And as you kind of see how it rises up like this on the pyramid, you see that basically you start out with physiological and then you move your way up. What the humanists believe, according to this model, is that we all strive throughout our entire life to try to fulfill each one of those needs to get to the very top of what's known as self-actualization. And even though not all of us make it, and it's kind of not, by showing it as a pyramid doesn't show it a very true form. It should be more as a step pyramid, I guess, because basically what happens to a lot of us is, okay, we get into that loving, belonging area there, of friendship, family, intimacy, and then all of a sudden you have a severe breakup, divorce. And all of a sudden, next thing you know, you've lost that part of your connection and you've fallen down back into either safety or even physiological. So when the humanist is talking here, it's not like we just continually grow all the time. There are setbacks, there are downfalls, and you have to build yourself back up, and it's a continual process over and over again. One of the things that a humanist talks about is what's called discongruence and incongruence, which basically is dealing with this idea that how you see yourself isn't necessarily how others see you. And the closer that you are to your self-concept, and the closer you are to that idea of how you see yourself and how others see you is very close, then you have what's called a stable personality and a stable relationship. You're very congruent. You're very intertwined. The problem comes when we have this incongruency, where we may see ourselves as being someone that is very caring, someone that's very giving, someone who's very, let's say, Christian in their ideas, and yet others don't see us this way because of the actions we're doing. The actions could be that, we don't give money to other people, we don't fund different organizations, we don't help other people out, we're constantly belittling other people, but yet we think of ourselves as being these good, wholesome, loving Christian people. So this incongruence then develops, and what it does then is it can cause us to have a lot of poor development in our self-esteem and our self-concept, which doesn't allow us to get to the very top of what the humanists are trying to achieve. The other person who came up with this theory is Abraham Maslow, and he kind of created this pyramid, the hierarchy of needs, and he believes that by basically satisfying one level at a time, we begin to activate higher levels of needs, and that's what drives us to become the very best we can. Okay, the last thing to talk about is what are the 5 changes in psychology over the last couple of years. And the first one is dealing back with cognitive. In the 1950s and 60s, they actually went back to Freud, and they went back to the psychodynamic theory. And the psychologists in the 50s and 60s and 70s, especially here now, have really began to do a lot of research with the brain. And so this became known as cognitive psychology. It's kind of an offshoot of psychodynamics. It deals with the mental processes, such things as memory, language, problem solving. How do we cognitively develop our brains? How do we deal with being able to memorize, and how do we lose memory? All of that is known as the cognitive psychologist perspective. And we're going to get a lot more into this as we get into some other units. The second big factor that has changed psychology over the years is that we began to get a deeper understanding about how exactly the brain works, and also looking at how the emotions affect the brain and affects how we process. Number the other big part then, dealing with this, is the fact that we have seen a very much shrunken world out there. Today, what years ago when psychologists did studies, they basically just were studying whites because they were the only ones in the universities. Today, we have seen that this is no longer true, and cultural diversity is huge when it comes to studying a psychology now because we have began to see how different cultures really are. The third perspective that has really caused a huge uproar in the last couple of years has been the biological perspective, studying about the chemical processes in our bodies. When we have stress, for example, we're going to get into this with one of the units, all of the different chemicals that goes pouring through our bodies when we're having stress and the effects of that can have very detrimental effects on our health. And we're going to kind of talk a lot more about that as we get into it. Two of the other big changes in psychology over the years has been this area in what's known as evolutionary psychology, which David Buss has been the primary pioneer in this area, studying about such things as natural selection and how it favors behaviors to deal with reproduction success, comparing men and women, and how these developments have grown over the years, and how there's been a lot of change going on with that, especially how women have really began to change and develop over the last 60, 70 years from this basically a gender of people that were thought to be quiet and to sit back and be reserved and sit in the kitchen and that kind of thing. Today we have women that are in college more than men are. They're graduating at higher rates. They're more successful in a lot of the areas. We're beginning to see a very change in the very realm of the gender relationship there. The last one then is positive psychology, and this is the newest area of psychology to be developed. Basically, one of the problems with psychology is you get into a lot of negatives. You get into a lot of depression, and you get into a lot of disorders and anxieties and all the bad things about human behavior. A lot of psychologists decided to change this by getting into what's called positive psychology, studying such things as happiness, love, joy, commitment, contentment, those kinds of things, looking at our strengths and virtues rather than our weaknesses. And one of the guys who's the leading pioneer in this is Martin Seligman, who basically focuses not on our weaknesses, but on how we are very positive and how those positiveness can help us in our problems and dealing with life. So those are the five big changes in psychology that's developed over the years. And that's going to pretty much bring us to about an end to our area of this unit. So at this point then, you pretty much have all the notes ready to go for what's going to be coming up on the test.